Federal fraud investigation in Minnesota took a new turn today. This time, agents are zeroing in on daycare centers and health clinics after a viral video touched off a firestorm.
I rely on childcare. I work. If childcare is cut, I'm unable to work or go to school. I understand fraud is bad.
Hello, we'd like to ask where the money's going. What do you guys think about the fraud that's taking place here in Minnesota?
Sorry. I don't think anybody is enabling fraud to happen.
Hold Governor Walz accountable for this.
The building opened every morning on schedule. Parents dropped off their children, staff followed routine checklists, and the day unfolded without incident. On paper, it was a licensed daycare operating within the rules. Nothing about the exterior suggested it was under federal scrutiny. That changed quietly.
Dollars set aside for needy children allegedly stolen from Minnesota taxpayers. Instead, it was used for lavish vacations and properties abroad. Several federal agencies now say they are getting involved.
Federal investigators had been reviewing financial data tied to public assistance programs when an anomaly appeared. Payments connected to child care services were unusually high, spread across multiple accounts, and recurring with a consistency that did not match enrollment records. Individually, the transactions raised no alarms. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be explained by normal operations. The review expanded. Analysts began tracing the flow of funds linked to the daycare's director. Records showed money moving through layered entities, each one appearing legitimate. Consulting fees, property expenses, administrative costs. The descriptions were routine. The volumes were not. Over time, the total climbed into the billions. Investigators moved cautiously. Fraud cases tied to childcare programs are not uncommon, but the scale here was different. The payments were structured to avoid immediate detection, broken into predictable amounts and routed through intermediaries designed to obscure origin and purpose. The structure suggested planning, not opportunism. As financial teams dug deeper, another thread emerged. Accounts connected to the same network appeared in separate enforcement databases, this time linked to narcotics investigations. Transfers coincided with known shipment windows. Payments cleared shortly before seizures occurred elsewhere in the country. The overlap was subtle but persistent. The connection could not be ignored. Joint task forces were formed quietly, bringing together financial crime specialists and drug enforcement units. Data was pooled. Timelines were compared. The picture that began to form suggested that the daycare operation was not an isolated fraud, but part of a broader system using legitimate services as cover. Surveillance followed. Agents documented the director's movements over weeks, noting meetings that had no clear business purpose. Locations changed frequently. Conversations were brief. Devices were rotated. The behavior aligned more closely with coordination than administration. Attention turned back to the daycare itself. Inspectors reviewed licensing records and compliance reports. On the surface, everything appeared in order. Staff certifications were current. Facilities met standards. Attendance logs were complete. But when investigators cross-checked those logs against payment data, inconsistencies emerged. Children listed as enrolled could not be verified. Service hours exceeded capacity. Documentation appeared templated rather than individualized. The findings prompted a shift. Authorities began preparing warrants, careful to avoid alerting anyone connected to the operation. They understood that exposure could trigger asset movement or destruction of records. The objective was containment, not confrontation. As the investigation widened, analysts identified additional entities tied to the same financial structure. Some were registered businesses. Others existed only on paper. Each one played a role in moving money away from its source, adding layers of separation that made tracing difficult. Drug enforcement data added urgency. Seizure reports linked to the same financial corridors indicated the movement of controlled substances at industrial scale. The volume suggested organization and upstream access, not fragmented distribution. Investigators now believed the daycare operation was a gateway, a way to introduce large sums of money into legitimate systems without raising suspicion. The decision to act came after months of review. Federal officials coordinated the timing carefully, aware that the presence of children required precision and restraint. The arrest would not take place during operating hours. Searches would be controlled. Records would be secured before any public notice. When agents moved in, they did so without spectacle. The daycare director was taken into custody away from the facility, minimizing disruption. Simultaneously, Teams executed warrants at offices and properties connected to the financial network. Devices were seized. Accounts were frozen. Documents were preserved. For parents and staff, the day began like any other. For investigators, it marked the exposure of a system they believed had been operating undetected for years. What started as a review of childcare payments had uncovered something far larger. A structure that blended public trust, financial complexity, and criminal coordination into a single operation. And as evidence from the first phase of enforcement was processed, one assessment became clear. This case was not about a daycare. It was about how easily legitimate services could be repurposed to hide activity on an extraordinary scale. With the director in custody and accounts frozen, investigators moved into the most time-sensitive phase of the case. The priority was no longer discovery. It was preservation. Digital forensics teams began isolating devices seized during the coordinated searches. Phones, laptops, external drives, and cloud accounts were secured to prevent remote access or deletion. Analysts understood that whatever remained inside those systems would determine whether the case stopped at fraud or expanded into something far more serious. The first extractions changed everything. Messages recovered from encrypted platforms revealed coordination well beyond routine business activity. Conversations referenced shipment timing, payment clearance windows, and coded confirmations that matched patterns seen in active drug trafficking cases. Language was deliberate, short, functional. Nothing was written casually. Analysts overlaid those communications with financial data. The alignment was immediate. Large transfers cleared shortly before key messages were sent. Follow-up confirmations appeared hours later. The sequence repeated again and again. This was not coincidence. It was synchronization. As teams reconstructed timelines, a structure began to emerge. The daycare operation functioned as an anchor. Funds entered the system through public programs, were redistributed through layered entities, and then surfaced in accounts connected to logistics and procurement. From there, money moved outward, supporting activities that had no visible connection to childcare or education. Investigators described it as a conversion mechanism. Legitimate funding was transformed into operational capital. Clean on entry. Obscured in transit, functional on exit. Financial analysts identified dozens of intermediary entities used in this process. Some were registered businesses with minimal activity. Others were shell companies sharing addresses, directors, or banking relationships. Each one added distance between source and destination, reducing the likelihood of detection. That distance was intentional. Records showed that no single account handled excessive volume. Transfers were split. Timing varied slightly. Documentation accompanied each movement. On its own, nothing triggered alarms. Viewed collectively, the pattern was unmistakable. Drug enforcement units expanded their review. Seizure data from multiple regions was compared against the financial timelines. When funds cleared through specific entities, seizures followed days later in different states. The correlation was too consistent to ignore. Analysts now believed the financial network was actively supporting drug movement at scale. Attention turned to logistics. Recovered communications referenced locations not previously associated with the case. Warehouses labeled as storage. Facilities described as temporary. Coordinates were shared without explanation. Investigators cross-checked those references against property records and found multiple sites leased under names tied to the financial network. Surveillance teams were deployed. At several locations, agents observed brief vehicle activity during late-night hours. Trucks arrived, remained for minutes, and departed without unloading visible cargo. The movements mirrored those seen in established trafficking operations, where speed and discretion were prioritized over concealment. Search warrants followed. At one facility, agents recovered packaging materials consistent with narcotics distribution. At another, they found records tracking quantities, routes, and delivery windows. The materials were organized, suggesting ongoing use rather than abandoned activity. As evidence accumulated, investigators revised their estimates. The volume of drugs supported by the financial network exceeded initial assumptions. Analysts now believe the operation was connected to narcotics movement valued in the billions, spanning multiple jurisdictions and supply chains. The daycare fraud was not peripheral. It was foundational. Federal agencies coordinated closely during this phase. Financial crimes units worked alongside narcotics teams and homeland security analysts. Information moved quickly. Patterns identified in one domain were tested against another. The case expanded laterally, revealing connections that would have remained hidden if examined in isolation. Officials emphasized caution. Despite the scale of the findings, prosecutors resisted rapid escalation. They understood that premature disclosures could prompt remaining participants to flee, destroy records, or shift operations. The objective was to map the full structure before making it visible. That restraint paid off. As pressure increased quietly, communications within the network began to change. Messages became more frequent. Questions appeared where instructions once stood. References to pausing and waiting surfaced repeatedly. Analysts interpreted the shift as uncertainty spreading through the system. Some participants attempted to adapt. Financial transfers were rerouted through unfamiliar channels. Logistics schedules were altered. New intermediaries appeared. Each adjustment introduced risk. Each deviation exposed another layer of the operation. Investigators tracked those changes carefully. When a previously unused account began receiving structured deposits, analysts flagged it immediately. When a new storage location appeared in communications, surveillance followed. The network's attempts to compensate for disruption created opportunities for further exposure. Public health data added urgency to the case. Officials reviewing overdose reports noted patterns aligning with the financial and logistics timelines under investigation. Spikes followed shipment windows. Declines appeared after enforcement actions constrained movement. While causation was evaluated cautiously, the association reinforced the stakes. Internally, the assessment hardened. This was no longer a fraud case with criminal overlap. It was an integrated system using public trust and institutional complexity to support large-scale narcotics activity. Each component depended on the others. Remove one and the system strained. Remove several and it began to fracture. By the end of this phase, federal teams had secured a comprehensive body of evidence. Financial flows were mapped. Logistics sites were identified. Communications patterns were documented. The daycare operation, once viewed as a single point of concern, was now understood as a gateway into a far broader network. And as investigators prepared to move into the next stage, one conclusion guided their approach. The most dangerous aspect of this operation was not secrecy. It was legitimacy. With the financial and digital structure exposed, investigators shifted their focus to the physical operations that the money had been supporting. The question was no longer whether the network was real, but how it functioned on the ground without drawing attention. The answer emerged through logistics. Agents reconstructed movement patterns using license plate readers, toll records, and commercial leasing data. Vehicles tied to the financial network followed consistent routes, often traveling between industrial zones late at night and returning before morning traffic increased. The timing was deliberate. The routes were efficient. The behavior suggested planning rather than improvisation. Several locations appeared repeatedly. Warehouses, light manufacturing spaces, and storage facilities were leased under different entity names but shared common contacts and payment methods. Utilities were kept low. Staffing was minimal. Activity occurred in short bursts rather than extended shifts. From the outside, nothing appeared unusual. Surveillance confirmed otherwise. At multiple sites, agents observed vehicles arriving in sequence, unloading sealed containers and departing within minutes. No signage. No visible inventory. The pattern mirrored known narcotics operations designed to minimize exposure and reduce the chance of interception. Search warrants were executed in a coordinated manner. At one facility, investigators discovered industrial equipment used for processing controlled substances. Pill presses, binding agents, and packaging materials were arranged with precision. Chemical residues matched those found in seizures across several states. Analysts concluded the site was not a transit point. It was a production hub. Additional locations revealed storage operations. Sealed packages were stacked behind false walls or concealed within legitimate cargo. The quantities recovered exceeded what would be expected for local distribution. Investigators estimated that the facilities supported regional supply, feeding multiple markets simultaneously. As the scope became clearer, federal estimates were revised again. Based on recovered records and physical evidence, analysts now believe the network had moved narcotics valued in the billions over an extended period. The volume was not the result of a single search. It reflected sustained, disciplined operation. Attention turned to how the network managed risk. Recovered communications showed strict internal rules governing movement and access. Locations were compartmentalized. Individuals assigned to logistics did not handle finance. Those involved in processing did not coordinate transportation. Each role was limited, reducing exposure if one element failed. This compartmentalization explained earlier enforcement challenges. Previous seizures had disrupted individual shipments without affecting the broader system. Replacement loads appeared quickly because production and storage were insulated from distribution losses. The network absorbed disruption as a cost of doing business. That resilience began to weaken as enforcement pressure increased. With accounts frozen and key coordinators removed, logistics schedules became inconsistent. Some sites remained inactive longer than planned. Others attempted to accelerate output to compensate. Those adjustments created visibility. In one instance, a facility increased activity during daylight hours to meet delayed schedules. Surveillance teams noted the change immediately. A warrant executed there uncovered additional records linking the site directly to the financial network anchored by the daycare operation. Those records were critical. They included shipment manifests, internal accounting notes, and coded references to distribution corridors. Analysts compared the manifests against overdose data and seizure timelines. The alignment reinforced the connection between production, distribution, and real-world harm. Public health officials briefed investigators on the implications. Overdose clusters appeared in regions shortly after shipments documented in the recovered records. Declines followed enforcement actions that constrained movement. The data suggested the network's output had a measurable effect on community health across multiple states. Investigators also examined how the operation maintained continuity. Training materials recovered from one site outlined procedures for onboarding new participants. The emphasis was on routine. Follow schedules. Use designated routes. Avoid unnecessary communication. The language mirrored that of legitimate operations manuals, replacing overt criminal instruction with process guidance. This approach reduced variability. By standardizing behavior, the network minimized mistakes and limited the need for direct oversight. Participants understood expectations without constant direction. That efficiency allowed the system to scale quietly. As evidence accumulated, federal agencies expanded coordination further. Information was shared with regional task forces, customs officials, and port authorities. Routes identified through the investigation were flagged for enhanced review. Financial institutions received updated advisories based on the patterns uncovered. The impact was immediate. Several shipments were intercepted at transit points before reaching distribution hubs. Financial transfers flagged under the revised criteria were halted pending review. The network's ability to adapt diminished as predictability gave way to scrutiny. Despite these gains, investigators remained cautious. They understood that networks of this scale rarely disappear overnight. They fragment. They retreat. They attempt to reorganize under new structures. The objective was not only to disrupt current operations, but to expose the mechanisms that enabled them. By the end of this phase, the investigation had established a clear picture. A licensed daycare operation served as a financial gateway. Funds were converted and distributed through layered entities. Logistics and production sites transformed that capital into narcotics output. Distribution networks moved product across regions with discipline and efficiency. The structure was no longer hidden. What remained was the challenge of accountability, and the question of how such an operation had been able to function within trusted systems for so long. That question would define the final stage of the case. With the production sites exposed and distribution routes mapped, investigators turned toward the systems that had allowed the operation to persist without interruption. The focus shifted from how the network moved drugs to how it avoided scrutiny while doing so. Financial oversight became central again. Auditors reconstructed the full life cycle of the funds tied to the daycare operation. Public money entered through legitimate channels, passed initial checks, and was approved based on documentation that appeared complete. From there, it moved through intermediary entities designed to resemble routine service providers. Each step reduced visibility. Each layer diluted accountability. Investigators noted that no single transaction appeared extraordinary. Amounts stayed within expected ranges. Transfers followed predictable schedules. Supporting documents were filed promptly. The system did not break rules outright. It exploited how rules were enforced. This exploitation was consistent. Records showed that reviews were often automated, relying on thresholds rather than patterns. As long as activity remained below specific limits, deeper examination rarely occurred. The network understood this and structured its behavior accordingly. Homeland Security analysts described it as adaptive compliance. Rather than hiding activity, the operation blended into expected behavior. It mirrored legitimate organizations closely enough to avoid suspicion. Familiarity became its shield. The daycare's role was critical in this process. As a licensed facility serving families, it carried inherent trust. Payments connected to childcare programs were not unusual. That trust reduced friction at every stage. Questions that might have arisen elsewhere were resolved quickly. Documentation was accepted. Oversight moved on. Investigators also examined how regulatory fragmentation contributed to the problem. Childcare licensing, financial oversight, and narcotics enforcement operated in separate domains. Information rarely crossed those boundaries unless prompted by clear anomalies. The network exploited that separation, ensuring that no single agency saw enough of the picture to trigger action. As the case developed, federal agencies began addressing those gaps. Data sharing protocols were expanded. Financial intelligence units were integrated earlier into benefit fraud reviews. Patterns that once appeared isolated were now analyzed collectively. The objective was not to assign blame, but to prevent repetition. At the same time, prosecutors prepared for the legal challenges ahead. The case involved complex financial flows, multiple jurisdictions, and layers of legitimate activity. Defense teams were expected to argue that proximity did not equal intent, and that legitimate services were being unfairly linked to criminal conduct. Prosecutors responded by focusing on documentation. Timelines were constructed showing how financial activity aligned with logistics and production schedules. Communications were contextualized carefully, demonstrating coordination rather than coincidence. Physical evidence from production sites was paired with financial records that supported their operation. Witness testimony added another dimension. Former employees and contractors described instructions that felt routine at the time. File this form. Process this payment. Renew this lease. None were told they were supporting criminal activity. But their accounts revealed how the system relied on compartmentalization, ensuring that no one individual understood the full scope. That compartmentalization was deliberate. By limiting knowledge, the network reduced risk. Individuals performed tasks without questioning outcomes. Processes continued uninterrupted. Oversight mechanisms designed to detect overt abuse struggled to identify coordinated misuse spread across domains. Public health officials contributed to the assessment. They provided data showing declines in overdoses following enforcement actions linked to the case. While officials avoided direct causation claims, the timing reinforced the impact of the disruption. The network's activity had not been abstract. It had affected communities in measurable ways. As these findings were compiled, federal officials emphasized restraint in public messaging. They avoided broad statements that could stigmatize communities or legitimate childcare providers. The focus remained on specific actions and documented evidence. Accountability would be individualized, not generalized. Internally, the case prompted reflection. Agencies reviewed how trust is assigned within systems and how that trust can be exploited. They examined where automation replaced judgment, and where routine replaced scrutiny. The goal was not to dismantle trust, but to reinforce it with verification. By the end of this phase, investigators had assembled a comprehensive case file. It detailed how a trusted institution became a gateway for financial manipulation, how layered oversight created blind spots, and how those blind spots were used to support one of the largest integrated fraud and drug operations the region had seen. What remained was the final step: determining how the system would respond, and whether the lessons uncovered would translate into lasting change rather than temporary disruption.